The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of New York as Lynn worked her usual shift at the Corner Cup Cafe. She carefully crafted each drink with a smile, even though her feet ached from standing for hours. At 23, she was just like many other young people in the city, running after big dreams while trying to keep up with sky-high rent and endless bills. "Here's your change," Lynn said warmly to an elderly woman who'd been counting pennies for her coffee. Without hesitation, Lynn had quietly added a few dollars from her own tip jar to make up the difference. The old woman's grateful smile made it worth every penny. What Lynn didn't know was that someone had been watching these small moments of kindness, not just today, but for months. A black car with tinted windows had been parked across the street more often than not, its passenger observing how Lynn would share her lunch with the homeless man who sat outside the cafe, or how she'd rescue stray cats and find them homes through social media. That ordinary Tuesday afternoon changed everything. Just as Lynn was hanging up her apron, ready to head home to her tiny studio apartment, a man in an expensive suit walked in. He looked out of place in the modest cafe, his perfectly polished shoes clicking against the worn floor tiles. "Are you Lynn?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of importance. When she nodded, he handed her a cream-colored envelope with her name written in elegant handwriting. "Mr. Park requests your presence at his estate tomorrow morning. A car will pick you up at 9 a.m. Lynn stared at the envelope, her heart racing. Mr. Park was a name everyone in the city knew, the reclusive billionaire whose story was filled with both success and tragedy. There must be some mistake, she said, but the man had already left, leaving only the scent of expensive cologne behind. That night, Lynn could barely sleep. She lived in a world where miracles didn't just happen, where billionaires didn't suddenly invite coffee shop workers to their homes. Her tiny apartment felt even smaller as she paced back and forth, reading and rereading the invitation. The next morning, exactly at 9 a.m., a sleek black car pulled up outside her building. The same car she'd never noticed watching her all those months. The driver, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, opened the door for her. "Ready to meet Mr. Park, miss." The drive took them away from the cramped city streets to the wealthy suburbs, where houses looked more like palaces. They finally stopped at a grand estate with iron gates and perfectly manicured gardens. Lynn's hands trembled slightly as she followed a housekeeper through endless hallways adorned with priceless art. Finally, they reached a sunlit room where an elderly man sat in a wheelchair, gazing out at his gardens. Mr. Park turned to face her, and Lynn was struck by the warmth in his eyes. They were nothing like the cold, calculating gaze she'd expected from a billionaire. "Ah, the kind soul from Corner Cup," he said softly, his voice weak but his smile genuine. "Please, sit down. We have much to discuss, and I'm afraid time isn't on my side anymore." Lynn sank into a plush chair, her mind spinning with questions. Why was she here? What could someone like Mr. Park want with her? She had no idea that this moment would be the beginning of an adventure that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others. As she sat there, watching the morning light dance across the room's antique furniture, Mr. Park began to tell her a story. A story about watching her through his car's window for the past year, seeing her small acts of kindness that she thought no one noticed. About how those moments reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. And about why, out of all the people in New York City, he'd chosen her for something extraordinary. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking the moments as Lynn's ordinary life was about to transform into something she could never have imagined. Mr. Park's next words would set in motion a chain of events filled with mystery, danger, and the chance to do more good than she'd ever dreamed possible, if she was brave enough to accept his unusual proposition. Mr. Park's hands shook slightly as he reached for a leather photo album on the table beside him. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the dust particles dancing in the air, making them sparkle like tiny stars. Lynn sat quietly, her heart beating fast as she waited for him to speak. "Do you believe in destiny?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Lynn could answer, he continued, "I've lived a long life, made billions of dollars, built an empire, but money means nothing when you've lost what matters most." He opened the album, revealing a photograph of a young girl with bright eyes and a carefree smile. "This is my daughter Joy," he said, his finger gently tracing the edge of the photo. 40 years ago, she disappeared without a trace. She was only 16. His voice cracked with emotion, and Lynn instinctively reached out to touch his hand, offering comfort the same way she did for troubled customers at her cafe. The police searched for months. I hired the best private investigators money could buy. But it was like she vanished into thin air. Mr. Park turned another page, showing newspaper clippings from 1984, their edges yellow with age. Headlines screamed about the missing daughter of one of the city's wealthiest businessmen. He closed the album and looked directly at Lynn. "I'm dying," he said simply, without self-pity. "The doctors give me 3 months at most. And before I go, I need to know what happened to my Joy." Lynn felt the weight of his words settle over the room. "But why me? I'm just a barista. I don't know anything about solving mysteries." Mr. Park smiled, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his face. "You have something more valuable than detective skills. You have a pure heart and sharp eyes. I've watched how you notice things others miss, like when you figured out that old Mr. Chen from the bookshop was struggling with his vision and started reading newspapers to him during your breaks." Lynn blushed, surprised that anyone had noticed these small moments. Mr. Park continued, "I'm offering you my entire fortune, $4.2 billion, if you can solve the mystery of what happened to Joy." The room seemed to spin around Lynn. The amount of money he mentioned was beyond her comprehension. She could barely afford her rent, and here he was offering her billions. "There must be someone better suited," she started to say. "There isn't," he interrupted firmly. "But there is something else you should know." He pressed a button on his wheelchair, and a screen descended from the ceiling. Security camera footage began to play, showing a man in an expensive suit entering an office late at night, rifling through files. "That's my nephew, Richard. He was 12 when Joy disappeared. Now he runs most of my company, and I've discovered some troubling things. I believe he knows what happened to Joy, but I can't prove it." Mr. Park's voice hardened. "If you don't solve this mystery within 1 year, everything goes to him." Lynn watched the footage, her mind racing. "Why 1 year?" "Because that's how long it will take for the truth to be buried forever," he replied cryptically. "Richard has been slowly erasing traces of the past, thinking I wouldn't notice. But I notice everything, just like you do." A knock at the door made them both jump. The housekeeper entered with tea, her movements careful and measured. As she poured, Mr. Park pulled out an envelope from his jacket. "Inside is a key to a safety deposit box. It contains everything I've gathered about Joy's disappearance over the years. Take it, study it, use it." Lynn's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. "What if I fail?" Mr. Park's eyes softened. "The question isn't whether you'll fail, but whether you'll try. Sometimes the kindest hearts are also the bravest." He glanced at his watch. "Richard will be here soon for our weekly meeting. You should go. The driver will take you home." As Lynn stood to leave, Mr. Park caught her hand. "One more thing. Trust no one completely, not even the people in this house. Joy trusted someone she shouldn't have, and it cost her everything." Walking back through the mansion's grand hallways, Lynn felt the weight of the envelope in her pocket like a stone. She had entered this house as a simple barista and was leaving with a mission that seemed impossible. As the driver opened the car door for her, she caught a glimpse of another car pulling up to the house. A sleek, black vehicle with tinted windows. Through the darkened glass, she could just make out the outline of a man in an expensive suit. The game was about to begin, and Lynn had no idea of the dangerous path that lay ahead. All she knew was that somewhere out there, a 40-year-old mystery was waiting to be solved, and a father was counting on her to bring him peace before his time ran out. Back in her tiny apartment, Lynn spread the contents of the safety deposit box across her worn kitchen table. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten as she lost herself in the remnants of a life frozen in time. Joy's diary lay open before her, its pages filled with neat handwriting and mysterious symbols that looked like ordinary doodles at first glance. "There has to be something here," Lynn muttered to herself, pushing her reading glasses up her nose. She had taken a month's leave from the cafe, using her savings to buy time. The wall of her living room had slowly transformed into an investigation board with old photographs and newspaper clippings connected by red strings. Joy's last diary entry was dated 3 days before her disappearance. The numbers don't add up. Someone's been moving money where it shouldn't go. I have to tell Dad, but first I need proof. Meeting tea tomorrow at the old clock tower. Lynn's fingers traced the strange symbols drawn in the margin, circles, squares, and lines that appeared throughout the diary's later pages. They seemed deliberate, too consistent to be random doodles. As she photographed them with her phone, a sharp knock at her door made her jump. Her heart racing, Lynn approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, she saw only an empty hallway. But when she opened the door, a white envelope lay on her welcome mat. Inside was a single typed message: "Stop digging up the past, or you'll join it." That night, Lynn could barely sleep. Every creak of her old apartment building made her sit up in bed. Around 3 a.m., a noise in her living room jolted her awake. Footsteps. Someone was inside. Holding her breath, Lynn grabbed her phone and slipped into her closet. Through the slats in the door, she watched a shadowy figure moving through her apartment, methodically searching through her investigation materials. The intruder wore black gloves and moved with purpose, photographing her investigation board before starting to take it down. Lynn's hands shook as she silently dialed 911. But before she could press call, the intruder suddenly stopped, head tilted as if listening. Then they quickly moved to the window and disappeared down the fire escape, taking several documents with them. When the police arrived, they found no fingerprints, no evidence. Only Lynn's scattered investigation materials and the lingering fear in the air. "You should be more careful about locking your windows," the officer said, not unkindly. "Lots of break-ins in this neighborhood." But Lynn knew better. This was no random burglary. Someone was watching her, someone who knew what she was doing. As she cleaned up the mess, she noticed something odd. The intruder had taken all the papers about Joy's last known whereabouts, but had left behind her diary. The next morning, exhausted but determined, Lynn took the diary to a quiet corner of the public library. She needed to think like Joy, understand what she might have discovered 40 years ago that was worth hiding even now. Opening her laptop, Lynn began researching the financial news from 1984. Hour after hour, she dug through old articles about Mr. Park's company. Then something caught her eye. A small news item about a massive computer upgrade in the company's accounting department just weeks before Joy's disappearance. As Lynn read, an elderly librarian approached her table. "Sorry to interrupt, dear, but someone left this book for you at the front desk." She handed Lynn a worn copy of Basic Cryptography. Lynn's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't told anyone she was coming to the library. Opening the book, a small note fell out. "The symbols are the key, but be careful who you trust with them." A friend. That evening, as rain pattered against her windows, Lynn sat cross-legged on her bed, the cryptography book open beside her. The symbols in Joy's diary were starting to make sense. They weren't random doodles, but a simple code. Each symbol represented a different letter or number. As she worked late into the night, decoding page after page, a pattern emerged. Joy had been tracking something, large sums of money moving between accounts, dates, locations. But more importantly, she'd written down names. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating Lynn's room for a moment. In that brief flash, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A face in a photograph on her wall, someone standing in the background behind Joy. Someone who still worked for Mr. Park's company today. Lynn quickly packed the diary and her notes into her backpack. She couldn't stay in her apartment tonight. It wasn't safe. As she rushed down the stairs, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're getting warmer." "But so are they. Watch your back." The rain soaked through her jacket as she hurried through the dark streets, looking over her shoulder with every step. She had no idea who to trust, but she knew one thing for certain. She was getting closer to the truth, and someone was desperate to keep it buried. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Lynn sat in a small coffee shop, far from her usual neighborhood, watching droplets race down the window. She hadn't been back to her apartment since the break-in, staying instead at a budget hotel using cash. Her phone lay on the table, switched off to avoid being tracked. A bell chimed as the coffee shop door opened, and an older man walked in, shaking water from his umbrella. He had the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Detective Wu had agreed to meet her after she'd left 3 messages at the police station mentioning Joy's name. "You're the barrister," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. It wasn't a question. I worked Joy's case back in '84, never could let it go. He ordered black coffee when the waitress came by, then pulled out a worn leather notebook from his jacket. Tell me what you found, he said quietly, and why someone broke into your apartment looking for it. Lynn glanced around the nearly empty cafe before pulling Joy's diary from her bag. As she explained about the coded messages and the mysterious financial transactions, Detective Wu's expression grew increasingly serious. We knew something was wrong with the company's accounts, he said, flipping through his old notes. But every time we got close to proving it, evidence disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. Then Joy vanished, and suddenly nobody wanted to talk anymore. A loud crash from the kitchen made them both jump. Lynn's hands shook as she pulled out the photograph she discovered, the one showing someone familiar in the background. That's Mrs. Chen, Detective Wu said, studying the image. She was the head accountant back then. Still works there, doesn't she? Lynn nodded. She's been there 40 years. But look at her expression in this photo, how she's watching Joy. And according to the diary, the computer system upgrade happened in her department right before. Before Joy disappeared, Wu finished. He stepped back, running a hand through his gray hair. Mrs. Chen was interviewed multiple times, but she had an alibi. She was at a conference in Hong Kong the week Joy went missing. What if she wasn't? Lynn pulled out her laptop, opening a file she discovered in the city archives. Look at this old employee travel record. Someone changed the dates of her conference trip after the fact. The original document shows she was actually in town the day Joy disappeared. Wu leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. We need to talk to her. But we have to be careful. If she's involved, she has powerful friends. That's probably who sent someone to search your apartment. Just then, Lynn's burner phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the old clock tower. 8 p.m. I know what happened to Joy. Come alone. Wu read the message over her shoulder and shook his head. It's too dangerous. Could be a trap. But what if it's not? Lynn said, what if it's the same person who left me the cryptography book? Someone's trying to help us. Or trying to silence you, Wu countered. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. This is my personal number. If you're going to that meeting, at least let me watch your back. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret. People get desperate when they feel it slipping away. As they left the cafe, Lynn noticed a black car across the street, its engine running. Wu saw it too and quickly guided her down a side alley. Take the back streets, he whispered. Switch cabs at least twice before going anywhere important. And Lynn, she turned back to look at him. Be careful who you trust, even me. That evening, Lynn stood in the shadow of the old clock tower, her heart pounding. The structure had been abandoned for years, its giant clock hands frozen at 3:47. The same time, she realized with a chill that Joy had last been seen alive. A figure emerged from behind a pillar, an elderly woman in a cleaner's uniform. You're the one asking questions about Joy, she said softly. I've worked in that building for 45 years. I was there that night. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag. And I've been keeping something safe, waiting for the right person to find it. In her wrinkled hands was an old USB drive, the type used in the early days of computers. Joy gave this to me the night she disappeared. Said if anything happened to her, I should keep it hidden until someone brave enough came looking for the truth. Lynn reached for the drive, but the woman pulled back slightly. Be careful, she warned. The people who wanted this to stay buried back then. They're still in power today, but maybe you're strong enough to do what Joy couldn't. As Lynn finally took the drive, a car engine roared to life nearby. The old woman melted back into the shadows with surprising speed. Find Detective Wu, she called out softly. He's not the only one who never stopped looking for justice. Lynn clutched the drive tightly as she hurried away from the tower, using the route Wu had shown her to lose any followers. Whatever was on this drive had been worth hiding for 40 years. Now she just had to stay alive long enough to discover what it was. The computer lab at the public library was nearly empty as Lynn inserted the old USB drive. Detective Wu stood watch near the door, pretending to browse magazines while keeping an eye out for any suspicious visitors. The drive was so old that they had to use one of the library's oldest computers to read it. Come on, Lynn whispered, watching the loading screen. After what felt like forever, a folder opened, revealing dozens of spreadsheets and documents. As she clicked through them, her eyes widened. "Detective, you need to see this." The files showed a complex web of fake companies, all connected to Mr. Parks Corporation. Millions of dollars had been moved through these shell companies, disappearing into offshore accounts. At the bottom of one spreadsheet was a note in Joy's handwriting: "Found the missing money. They're stealing from Dad's charity foundation." "The Children's Hospital Foundation," Wu said quietly. "Mr. Park started it after his wife died of cancer. It was supposed to provide free treatment for kids who couldn't afford it." Lin opened another document, a scan of an old letter. "Look at this. Mrs. Chen wasn't just covering up the theft. She was being blackmailed by someone inside the company, someone who knew about her past." Before Wu could respond, the computer screen suddenly went black. Then white text appeared. "Accessing restricted files. Security protocol initiated." A progress bar started counting down from 60 seconds. "Someone's watching us," Wu said urgently. "They've accessed the library's network. We need to go. Now." Lin's hands flew across the keyboard, trying to copy the files before they were deleted. The progress bar kept counting down. 30 seconds, 20 seconds. Just then, she noticed movement at the library entrance, 2 men in dark suits walking purposefully toward the computer lab. Wu moved quickly, positioning himself between them and Lin. 10 seconds, Lin whispered, watching the copy progress bar inch forward. The men were getting closer. 5 seconds left. The file copy completed just as the screen went completely dark. Lin grabbed the USB drive and the backup she'd managed to make, stuffing them into her pocket. Wu guided her toward the emergency exit at the back of the lab. They burst out into the alley behind the library just as they heard shouting from inside. The rain had started again, helping to cover their escape through the maze of back streets. They didn't stop running until they reached Wu's old car, parked several blocks away. "We can't go back to your hotel," Wu said as they drove through the city. "They'll be watching it now." He took a series of random turns, making sure they weren't being followed. "I have a safe house we can use to look at those files properly." This safe house turned out to be Wu's daughter's apartment. She was away at college. As they spread the copied documents across the kitchen table, a pattern began to emerge. The charity foundation wasn't just being robbed, Lin said, connecting the pieces. They were using it to hide money from other illegal operations. "Look at these dates. Every time the foundation announced a new hospital wing or medical program, a matching amount would disappear into these fake companies." Wu nodded grimly, and Joy figured it all out. She was going to expose everything. But why didn't she just tell her father? Lin wondered aloud, flipping through more documents. "Because," Wu said slowly, "according to these records, the person authorizing all these transfers was using Mr. Park's personal signature stamp. They made it look like he was involved." Lin's heart sank as she realized the truth. They were framing him. Joy must have discovered that someone was setting up her father to take the fall. That's why she was gathering evidence first. She needed proof of his innocence. A photo slipped from between the pages, showing a young Joy standing with a group of executives. In the background, barely visible, was a familiar face, Richard, Mr. Park's nephew, looking much younger but wearing the same cold expression he had today. "There's something else," Wu said, examining an old security report. "The night Joy disappeared, she wasn't just meeting someone at the clock tower. According to this, she had arranged to meet with a reporter from the city newspaper." Lin's phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Park's house. "His condition is getting worse. The doctors say he might not have much time left." As thunder rolled outside, Lin and Wu looked at each other, knowing they were running out of time. The truth about Joy's disappearance was finally within reach, but the people who had buried it 40 years ago were still out there, still powerful, and now they knew exactly who was looking for answers. "We need to move fast," Wu said, gathering the documents. "But first, there's someone else we need to talk to. The reporter Joy was supposed to meet that night. If he's still alive, he might be the key to everything." Lin stared at the photograph of Joy, so young and determined to protect her father. "We're close," she whispered. "Just hold on, Mr. Park." We're going to find out what really happened to your daughter. The old newspaper office had been converted into luxury apartments, but the coffee shop on the ground floor still served as a meeting place for retired journalists. That's where they found him, the reporter who was supposed to meet Joy 40 years ago. Mr. Lee sat in a corner booth, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking much older than his 70 years. "I've been waiting for someone to ask about that night," he said, his voice rough with age. "For 40 years, I've been waiting." Lin and Detective Wu sat across from him, rain drumming against the windows behind them. The coffee shop was almost empty, but they still spoke in hushed tones. "Joy contacted me 3 days before she disappeared," Mr. Lee continued. "Said she had proof of massive financial fraud. Told me to meet her at the clock tower at midnight. I got there early, watched from across the street. I saw her arrive carrying a briefcase. Then a car pulled up." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. 2 men got out. One of them was just a kid back then, Richard, her cousin. They talked for a few minutes. Then I saw a flash of metal in the streetlight. "A gun?" Wood asked quietly. Mr. Lee shook his head. "A needle. Before I could do anything, they grabbed her. The briefcase fell, papers scattered everywhere. They put her in a car and drove away. I tried to follow, but lost them near the docks." Lin's heart was racing. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "I did." Mr. Lee's eyes met Wu's. "But when I got to the station, Richard's father, Mr. Park's brother, was there with 2 lawyers. They already had a story ready about Joy running away to Europe. Had fake passport records and everything. By the time I could prove otherwise, the trail was cold." Just then, Lin's phone buzzed. A text from the housekeeper at Mr. Park's mansion. "Come quickly, he's asking for you." They rushed through the rainy streets to Mr. Park's estate. The security guards seemed different, new faces Lin didn't recognize. As they approached Mr. Park's room, they heard raised voices. "It's over, Uncle," Richard's voice carried through the door. "Just sign these papers and we can all move on." Lin pushed the door open. Mr. Park sat in his wheelchair, looking frailer than ever. Richard stood over him with a document. When he saw Lin and Wu, his face hardened. "This is a private family matter," he said coldly. "Security." "Wait." Lin stepped forward, pulling out the USB drive. "Before anyone moves, you should know that copies of Joy's evidence have already been sent to every major news outlet in the city." Richard's confident smile faltered slightly. "Evidence of what?" "Of how you and your father stole millions from the Children's Hospital Foundation," Lin said. "Of how you framed Mr. Park to take the fall if anyone discovered it. And most importantly," she paused, looking directly at Mr. Park, "of what really happened to Joy that night at the clock tower." The room went very quiet. Mr. Park's hands gripped his wheelchair arms. "Richard, what did you do to my daughter?" "Nothing," Richard snapped. "She was going to ruin everything. We just wanted to scare her. Make her disappear for a while until things cooled down. But she fought back when we tried to sedate her. The dose was too high." "No," a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. There stood Mrs. Chen, the accountant, holding a tablet computer. "That's not what happened at all." She walked into the room, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. "I couldn't live with a lie anymore, so I've been helping Lin, leaving her clues. And now it's time for the truth." Mrs. Chen turned to Mr. Park. "Joy didn't die that night. Richard and his father took her to a private hospital in Hong Kong. They kept her sedated while they set up a new identity for her. Then they gave her a choice: stay dead and live a comfortable life far away, or come back and watch her father go to prison for fraud." Lin watched as understanding dawned on Mr. Park's face. "She chose to protect me," he whispered. "Yes," Mrs. Chen said softly. "She's been living in Australia all these years, under a different name. I've been keeping track of her, making sure she's safe. She has a family now, children of her own." And she handed the tablet to Mr. Park. "This is her." On the screen was a video call, and there she was. Joy, 40 years older but with the same kind eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she saw her father for the first time in 4 decades. "Dad," she said softly. "I'm so sorry." Richard lunged for the door, but Detective Wu was faster. As he handcuffed Richard, more police officers entered the room, they had been waiting outside, listening to everything. Lynn stood quietly by the window, watching as father and daughter spoke through tears and laughter, 40 years of separation dissolving in moments. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the first rays of sunrise were breaking through the clouds. The mystery was solved, but Lynn knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something new. A family reunited, justice served, and the truth finally set free after all these years. 1 month later, Lynn stood in the airport arrival terminal, holding a handmade sign. Around her, families reunited with hugs and tears, but she waited for someone special. When Joy walked through the gates with her husband and 2 grown children, it was like watching a scene from a dream become real. Mr. Park sat in his wheelchair beside Lynn, his hands trembling with emotion. Though the doctors had given him only months to live, his joy at finding his daughter seemed to have given him renewed strength. As Joy knelt to embrace her father, there wasn't a dry eye in the terminal. "Thank you," Joy whispered to Lynn later as they drove to Mr. Park's estate. "Not just for finding me, but for giving my father peace." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. Richard and his father faced criminal charges for fraud and kidnapping. The stolen money was recovered and returned to the Children's Hospital Foundation. Mrs. Chen provided all the evidence needed to ensure justice would finally be served. Detective Wu retired officially this time, saying the case that had haunted him for 40 years was finally closed. But he still met Lynn for coffee every week, both of them having found a friendship neither expected. On a warm spring morning, Lynn sat beside Mr. Park in his garden. His health had improved enough that doctors now gave him 6 months instead of 3. Joy had decided to stay in the city, making up for lost time with her father. "It's time we discussed your reward," Mr. Park said, handing Lynn a thick envelope. Inside were documents transferring his entire fortune to her name, just as promised. Lynn looked at the papers, then back at the man who had changed her life. "I have a different idea," she said softly. 2 days later, they held a press conference announcing the creation of the New Beginnings Foundation. The entire Park fortune would fund it, dedicated to helping missing persons and their families, supporting children's health care, and investigating cold cases that others had given up on. "Every person deserves to know the truth about their loved ones," Lynn said to the reporters. "And every family deserves a chance to heal." She kept her job at the coffee shop, though now she owned the building. She turned the upper floors into a free community center where Detective Wu taught self-defense classes to young women, and Mrs. Chen gave accounting lessons to students who couldn't afford college. Joy's children, fascinated by their grandfather's business empire, began learning how to manage the foundation. The youngest had her mother's sharp eye for numbers and her grandfather's kind heart. 1 year to the day after Lynn first received that cream-colored envelope inviting her to Mr. Park's estate, she stood in front of the old clock tower. The city had approved its renovation into a community space, funded by the foundation. The clock's hands, frozen for so many years at 3:47, now moved freely again. As she unlocked the front door, Lynn remembered something Joy had told her. Sometimes the biggest acts of kindness come from the smallest moments of courage. The newly renovated tower would house a center for families of missing persons, providing resources, support, and hope. The wall of the main room displayed a quote that Lynn had chosen: "Every mystery has a solution. Every lost soul can be found. All it takes is one person brave enough to seek the truth." Mr. Park watched the tower's reopening ceremony from his wheelchair, Joy by his side. Though his time was growing short, his legacy would live on through the foundation and the countless lives it would touch. That evening, Lynn returned to her coffee shop. She still served every customer herself, remembering how this whole adventure began with simple acts of kindness. As she prepared a drink for an elderly woman counting pennies, Lynn quietly added extra money from her own wallet, just as she had done so many times before. A young girl watching from the corner asked, "Why did you do that?" Lynn smiled, thinking of all that had happened because someone had once noticed her small acts of kindness. "Because sometimes," she said, "the smallest gesture can start the biggest change." The next morning, she found an envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a note from Mr. Park. "You didn't just solve a mystery, you restored a family. No fortune could ever match the value of that gift." As Lynn walked to work, she passed the clock tower, its restored face gleaming in the morning sun. The hands showed 3:47, but now it was just another time of day, no longer frozen in a moment of loss. Like the Park family, like Lynn herself, time had moved forward, turning an end into a new beginning. And somewhere in the city, another story was waiting to unfold, another mystery ready to be solved. But for now, Lynn was content knowing that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in billion-dollar fortunes, but in the simple courage to do what's right, one small kindness at a time.